Hi there, my name's Charlie Lees. I'm a gastroenterologist here in Edinburgh, and I'd like to take a moment of your time to tell you about the PREdiCCt program of research that we're running here, why we're doing it, and why we believe it's really important. By way of introduction, inflammatory bowel diseases, Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, in the first half of the last century were relatively uncommon. We saw the first reports coming out by Thomas Dalziel in Glasgow in 1913, and of course Burrell Crone in the early 1930s. But it's only when we get to the 1950s, 60s, 70s that we start to see more and more cases emerging and the incidence becoming really, really recognised in the Western world. So in UK, Western Europe, North America, incidence cases are high. And then from the 1980s to the present, across the rest of the world, particularly the developing world, when we look at the Far East, when we look at South Africa, when we look at South America, we're starting to see the incidence emerge as these countries are adopting a westernized lifestyle. This increase in incidence is associated clearly with urbanization. It's also associated with westernization, with lifestyle, and in particular, diet. Now, in Scotland in particular, we've got a very rich data set when you look at early onset inflammatory bowel disease, going back to Anne Ferguson's day and through to David Wilson now. And this gives us a very rich trajectory of IBD incidence in the early onset group from the 1960s and 70s to the present day, which equates to this extraordinary five-fold increase in the rate of incidence over that time period. What's causing that? What's driving it? We don't really know. But one thing is for clear, that is in the future, if you look across the world, all trajectories are that IBD is becoming a truly global pandemic healthcare problem with associated cost and resourcing issues. So in the middle of 2018, we can ask what the current issues that face us are. What causes IBD? We don't know. Can we make a timely diagnosis everywhere? And that's so important, particularly in areas where IBD has not been so common before. We know that we need to get people diagnosed quickly, accurately staged, and then into specialty care because that improves outcomes. Then, how do we stratify patients by risk and biology to get them on the right treatment, the right time? And ideally doing that first up. But we know that we're not so good at that now. Our prognostic tools are still relatively limited. So we know that we're much better at monitoring than we are at predicting. In fact, we've had to get good at monitoring because we're not so good at predicting outcomes. Can we prevent IBD? No. Can we cure it once it's developed? No. Will we be able to? Well, these should be our goals. But seeing as we can't do that, what's our next best thing? Well, we should be preventing disease flares and stopping the disease from progressing. I believe that that's the secret to where we get to in the next few years that would be utterly transformative for people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and I'll come to the details of that soon. And then I think a few really other important bits to think about. How do people with IBD improve outcomes themselves? What can they do? What should they eat? How should they live their lives? Should they exercise regularly? Those different factors that we just don't know the answers to. How do we address the unmet therapeutic need? And there's a huge biotech investment in Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis now, which is good. The drug pipeline is very rosy, but there is still a huge unmet therapeutic need as of today. And then empowering patients with access to their own healthcare records with signage, hyper-personalized where possible to the relevant information and tools to improve their lives. When we distill it all down, the cause and consequences of IBD can be boiled down to the effect of the environment, how it manipulates our gut microbiota, and how that happens on our underlying genetic susceptibility. My background is of a decade in gene discovery experiments that we did with the UK and the International IBD Genetics Consortium. getting together this huge cohort of tens of thousands of people with well-characterized Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, taking DNA samples and looking for changes in the DNA in people with Crohn's disease versus controls and people with ulcerative colitis versus controls. And this has been a phenomenally successful series of experiments that has taught us a huge amount about the biology and the underlying genetic architecture of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. These gene associations, whilst not very big in their individual effect sizes, we are seeing are associating with treatment pathways that we're now seeing working in the clinic. But I was slightly disillusioned by the ability of genetics to tell us who would get disease and what would happen to an individual when they got disease. They wouldn't really even help us tell what type of disease someone got. So we start to look more detail at both the microbiota and the environment for some of these clues. Now, the microbiota has generated huge amounts of interest in recent years over a number of different topics. We see in Crohn's patients versus ulcerative colitis patients versus healthy controls a difference. If you do what we call a principal component plot, as you see up here on the top left, you can see that they separate out in space. But this is in people when they already have the disease process. So what we don't know is which of this has caused that to happen, but which of this is the effect of the underlying inflammation and the treatments, etc., that we have given. And this is a big problem and one that we can only get at if we look at unbiased cohorts of people sampled before the development of any disease and then followed over time. This is a big challenge because you need to look at lots of people, because the vast majority of people, of course, will never develop disease, despite us now having prevalence rates in the UK of close to 1%. Now, the environment is very close to all of us, of course, because it's the environment we live in. And if we look at just some of the factors that have been associated with the development of inflammatory bowel disease and maybe also associated with the disease cause, we've got sleep, we've got diet, we've got tablets, hygiene, emulsifiers, travel, geography, exercise. We've got surgery, smoking, stress, and sunlight and vitamin D. Now, they can't all be true. Some of them will have effects that are contingent or others. There are multiple confounders based within that. But probably within this lies some of the secrets to why people with IBD across the world are getting more and more inflammatory bowel disease as the countries they live in, as the lifestyles are adopting much more of a westernized approach with urbanization, diet shifts, with food processing and manufacturing changes that are so very, very marked. The GEM study has been trying to get at some of these issues, led by Ken Croitreau out of Mount Sinai in Toronto. GEM has looked at 5,000 healthy, young, first-degree relatives of people with Crohn's disease, and sampling the microbiota and blood and urine and looking at diet and lifestyle in those healthy people, and then following them over time with 6 monthly interviews out to at least 3 years. And over time, we're looking at 70 to 80 incident cases of Crohn's disease, where, as you can see, the vast majority, 4,900 or so, that don't develop it, and you can compare all those factors. So I was very fortunate to get involved with this in the UK a good number of years ago now. From Edinburgh, we set up this research infrastructure across Scotland, England and Wales, and we did, I think, a very good effort in contributing to the global effort with a very significant percentage of the patients coming from the UK. So I think a big tick there. We await the data, of course. We await to see just how much GEM's going to tell us and how much we're going to need further follow-on studies to look and find the causes of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Moving on a bit and thinking about how we can tackle more manageable parts of this process, I've been thinking about disease flare, about how we might identify the causes of disease flare, and how we might then, of course, target to prevent it. So let's look at a schematic of an individual with inflammatory bowel disease that starts right at the bottom left from birth with our inherited DNA, our initial environment, and our microbiota that's stabilized over the first maybe 3, 4, 5 years of life. Some things happen, maybe in early life for some people, maybe later in life for others, that lead from priming events to a susceptibility state, triggering events that lead to a preclinical inflammatory state, and then at some point breakthrough to symptoms, ultimately leading to a diagnosis of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, hopefully in a timely manner, and then ideally treatments the first time that are then going to induce deep remission. So not just symptom remission, but also getting the disease properly under control with no inflammation. And if that's all there was, great. Not ideal, but maybe not disastrous. Unfortunately, though, most people with IBD, we're seeing disease flares happening. And those disease flares happen regularly, all too often, without the disease ever going into deep remission in between times. And then we're seeing the evolution of disease with increased amounts of bowel damage, with fistula, with strictures, with the need for operations, and, in worst case scenarios, stomas and ostomies being formed. And these are something that we're desperately trying to prevent for people. Now, you may ask, why don't we just get rid of inflammatory bowel disease completely? Why don't we prevent it from even occurring in the first place? Now, indeed, that would be a lofty goal, and I think that is something we should strive to do. But I think this is a challenge. To do this, to get to that point, what we're really going to need to do is work out what causes the disease, work out for the biomarkers for people who are at risk, and then be able to intervene to prevent the disease from happening. And then we don't really know how long an individual is going to be at that at-risk state and how long we're going to have to adopt this prevent strategy. So let's work towards this, but let's not expect that around the corner just now. Perhaps let's look at stripping this back so that we get rid of the evolution of disease and then get rid of disease flares so that there is that initial hump and then we go to prolonged remission. Now, the way that we're doing this in the clinic now is with an optimized treat-to-target approach, so that at diagnosis we stratify our patients as best we possibly can by risk and by biology. Now, in both these facets, we're lacking data at the moment, and there is a big research effort underway to try and to discover the genetic and microbial and environmental factors that underpin both of these facets. But that, to my mind, is the goal of treatment to allow us to adopt a treat-to-target approach. Risk, biology, right drug strategy the first time, get people well, monitor, of course, and optimize to treat to target. Looked at slightly differently, it looks like this. It looks like getting deep into remission straight away, treating early with our most effective drugs so that we treat within the inflammatory window of opportunity, so we're not trying to treat the complications of disease with our anti-inflammation medicines, and in doing so, flattening out this curve of disease progression over time. So looked at slightly differently, person gets IBD, stratified by risk and biology, use the right drugs at the right time, do away with flares, do away with the evolution of disease. And if we could do that, I think that's achievable within the next 5 years perhaps, and would be utterly transformative if we could get to that for at least a significant proportion of people with IBD. So flares with IBD are something I've been thinking about a lot. How often do they occur? There's relatively poor literature on that. What causes the disease flares to happen? What factors, what are the genetic factors? What are the environmental, the microbial, lifestyle, dietary factors? Can we predict who will flare and when? The moment we can't. What can people with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis do to prevent the disease from flaring? What should I eat, Dr. Lees? That's a very common question in the clinic. What should I do with my life? What can I do to help improve my outcomes? Let's empower people with the information they need. And it may very well be that dietary strategies, for example, if we can work out which the right ones are, will get the microbiota into a favorable state, if we can identify what that is, that helps to improve things moving forwards. So the PREdiCCt study we've set up to look and tackle at least some of these questions in a large, accurately phenotyped cohort of people with IBD from throughout the United Kingdom in the first place. These are our initial aims, finding the environmental and dietary factors for patients to avoid because they trigger disease flare, finding out behaviors for people to adopt because they bring about remission and ideally prolonged remission, finding out what the microorganisms that predict flare look like, i.e. what's the bits of the gut microbiota that predict flare, indeed what's the signature that predicts prolonged remission. That's what we should be striving towards. Gaining information that help future studies at finding better diets and better treatment strategies for people with IBD, and putting this all together in a package that enables people to manage their own care in a way that is meaningful and powerful. In terms of the primary objectives that are largely the factors that we took initially to power the study statistically and help to inform the study design, we're looking at mostly dietary factors that might predict flare. So you can see we're looking at animal protein intake, we're looking at dietary fiber, we're looking at the N6 polyunsaturated fatty acids, and we're looking at the dietary emulsifiers, all of which we believe from some of the evidence that's available so far may predict disease flare, but we're not really sure which do, and indeed they may not apply to all individuals, and it may be contingent on other disease factors that we're looking at. And then we're going to look at the microbial content, the gut microbiota. We'll also look at genetics, initially just looking at a total gene count in the microbiota, testing the idea that people with lower bacterial diversity, a less healthy perhaps microbiota, are at increased risk of flare and disease progression. People come into the study in clinical remission with a very important secondary endpoint, secondary definition of people who are in deep remission. So at baseline, we look at the symptoms score as well as the calprotectin and the CRP. And then we're following people to the point of clinical flare, with a soft clinical flare as the primary outcome, but with a very important secondary outcome of hard disease flare, as you can see defined here as the occurrence of a clinical flare plus commencement of any new medication with a robust inflammatory response, a CRP raise and or a calprotectin elevation. We're well over a third of the way into recruiting our target sample size of just over 3,000 people with a roughly even contribution of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. We're looking for people who have a confirmed disease. We're looking for people who are in clinical remission. We're looking at people who are at least 6 months post-diagnosis and who are at least 2 months since a change in their therapy for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and 6 years or over. So no upper age limit. Children are very, very welcome indeed. So very broad, inclusive criteria to get involved in the study. So many, many people that come along to your clinics, many people out there with Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis will be eligible for the study. The exclusion criteria are straightforward, listed on the screen here. Perhaps most importantly, no steroids for the last 2 months, no change in therapy for the last 2 months, please. So here's the broad schematic for the study, taking a snapshot here, looking at patients coming in clinical remission. And so we check the stool for calprotectin at baseline so that we can then subdivide people into clinical versus deep remission. And we'll be doing a series of analyses on that. 3,100 people in clinical remission. A detailed baseline demographic survey and phenotyping that's done from the hospitals. A diet survey that is both a food frequency questionnaire online and a 4-day weighed food diary where people weigh every component of their food and write it down in a diary over 4 days with a brief interview on the telephone with a dietitian to go through that food diary afterwards. And then on day 4, they send in their stool samples for the microbiota and they send in the stool sample for the calprotectin analysis. Saliva sample comes in too for whole genome sequencing, which the Sanger Institute are doing along with the whole metagenomic sequencing of the gut microbiota. The lifestyle and environmental surveys, all of which are done from the safety and comfort of someone's own home on the computer through the dedicated web portal at the moment, but soon to be replaced by a dedicated smartphone app. These things are done to look at sleep, lifestyle, hygiene, quality of life, stress and anxiety, physical exercise, a huge number of different questionnaires that people can do very simply, as I say, from home. And then the important phase of follow-up starts, and it's designed to be really simple and not too onerous for people. The baseline questionnaires and samples take about an hour at the start. The follow-up questionnaires that are done every month take roughly 5 minutes, because most of the time people are well, they simply click a few points, have their medications changed, any major life events, And then if they've been unwell, if there's been a flare, there are a few more questions that are thrown up. And importantly, we're asked patients to send in further stool samples so that we can look for the changes in the microbiota at that point and also look to see what the calprotectin has been at the point of disease flare. And people can then stay in the study after a disease flare. People can flare multiple times over the 2 years so that we can look at the total number of flares in some people versus those that don't flare at all. Primary endpoint, as you see, disease flare. So finally, just to mention a really exciting development for PREdiCCt that we're implementing over the course of this summer, and that's the transition to OSHI as the data capture tool for people entering into the study. Now, OSHI's been set up as a startup. It is a startup that's looking to collect symptom scores to allow patients to track their disease with hyper-personalized information and signposting to help improve the quality of their life with IBD. The startup, OSHI, has just started some of this information out in North America. What we're doing with PREdiCCt is we are generating a bespoke clinical portal for entering this data that will allow people with IBD in the study to input all their data and will allow signposting back. We'll use the other cut of that bit from the last time because that made no sense at all. So, to finish, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed for listening. If you'd like to take part in the study, all the information is on the screen. If you'd like to help out in other ways, please get in touch with me directly. I'm always on the lookout for people who can help fund expansions to the study. There's many other aspects to this work we can take on board if we have extra funding, including expanding the study out to sites outside of the United Kingdom. Be very keen to look at doing that, both in other Western populations, but also in other parts of the world where we can perhaps learn more by looking at different dietary shifts, for example, and other lifestyle and environmental patterns in other areas. Thanks very much.